really Sunday morning, raining, you all turned up, well done. I have a confession to start with. Last night, I actually, after a very long time, many years, wanted to pull a sickie. It's not because of the India-Pakistan match. I seriously got daunted by the scope of the panel, what Madhavi calls capacious. I couldn't string through a narrative which I wanted to run through. And I also felt that JLF must have tried every moderator possible and then finally landed up on me that, okay, there you go. What made me decide against it is that I also was given 4 extremely talented and exciting writers. And it's the pleasure of meeting you 4 that dragged me out. And I'm not going to individually go through their CVs and their writings. Angela, Kenan, Madhavi, Meena, they have written extensively. Their presence is felt on the web. They have their websites. Have a look at it. What I'll try and do today, there should be no discipline in the manner which I focus on subjects and try and jump from trope to trope. I'll invite the panelists to jump in, interrupt me when they want to. And hopefully, through this chaos, we'll find something emerging. I will start with you, Angela. Congratulations on the reviews your new book is getting. It's been tremendous everywhere. In Superiority, you talk about, you demolish the idea of race, how it's seen, how it's understood, and you go through several disciplines to do this. But one of the things you speak about is how science, as you told me last night, that science is used to back up the claims one makes about race, superiority of race, genes and gene testing, which is so prevalent now. Would you want to take us through, I mean, I can understand why the far right would want a solid scientific base, but why it's become so prevalent in recent years and to back up this thing about we are superior to others?
It's complicated because I think a lot of us feel so attached to our racial identities, partly because society requires us to know what race we are and tick the appropriate boxes on the forms, but also we imagine that ideas that we have about race in the present day extend back into the mists of time, that forever things have been a certain way. Britain has always been white. The Hindu nationalists in India would say India has always been Hindu. We have quite firm ideas around caste, race. I invoke religion here because sometimes these are all mixed up with each other, ideas of ethnicity and race and religion.
But religion and science also go very closely in India.
We do, and I do look at that as well. And actually, when you look genetically, so when scientists talk about race, and they try not to talk about race generally these days because it's seen, 1, as unscientific, and 2, inappropriate and taboo in scientific circles to talk about it. But geneticists, as they told me when I was researching Superior, keep saying, we don't know why people keep banging on about racial identity, why they keep talking about race, because when you look at our DNA, the vast majority of human difference is individual difference. More than 95% of the human variation between every one of us in this room is down to individual difference, and only a small proportion is down to group difference or population level difference. That's not to say it doesn't exist, it does exist, but it's a tiny proportion of it. We amplify it in our minds because we've been trained, because of the way society is structured, because of the politics and the history of this idea, to look for the tiny cues, those tiny little traits that will tell us where somebody is from. And different communities do this very differently. Around the world, we do it differently. So ideas of race in America are different from classifications in South Africa, or India, or Australia. Every country in the world has their own ideas about what makes you, you. Now, for example, just take my own personal race, if you want to call it that, or colour. When the idea of Caucasianness, so Caucasian, of course, is the polite word that we use to describe white people. It sounds scientific, Caucasian, it feels very scientific. But when Johann Blumenbach, so he was kind of these early researchers, Enlightenment researchers, was studying the skulls of different races, and he thought the people from the Caucasus had the most beautiful skulls. But he defined Caucasian as everyone from Western Europe to Northern India, which by that definition would make me Caucasian, which in modern day parlance would make me white. I am also brown, quite obviously. I'm brown, and that's, you know, the word that people use to describe me, Asian or brown. Politically, the National Union of Journalists, and when I was campaigning against racism when I was at university in the 90s and 2000s, I would be classified as black, being not white. So to be not white was to be politically black. So I am white, brown, and black all at the same time. And I think that really speaks to, in some ways, the arbitrariness of these classifications and how they work. They serve the politics of the time and place that they're in. And they always have done. And they always will do. So, for example, Britain, we imagine, and you know, this plays into nationalist ideas around Brexit, these ethnic nationalist ideas. Europe has always been white. You know, even if we are all, people are all different. In the, you know, its origins are whiteness, and to be ethnically British must mean being white. But scientists have found, so one of the oldest skeletons or intact skeletons ever found in this country, 9,000 years old, the Cheddar Man, which you may remember was analysed. So he was found almost 100 years ago, discovered, we didn't know what Cheddar Man looked like, and reconstructions gave him a white face, brownish, long trailing hair. We didn't know, because you can't tell someone's skin colour from a skeleton. And in recent years, when DNA has been tested, and now scientists are able to take ancient DNA and run these tests, which they weren't able to do before, and they found that we do not have genes for blackness or whiteness or any racial group. There are no racial genes. But you can tell, perhaps you have some indication of what someone's skin colour might be based on some commonalities that we see amongst different groups that are alive today. You know, you can make a kind of educated guess. It's not a reliable guess, but an educated guess. And they discovered that it is very likely that the Cheddar Man had dark skin. Dark skin to the point where in modern day language, and this is not an appropriate way to think about people in the past because they didn't look the way we do now, even 10,000 years ago, he would be considered black. So here we know the earliest hunter-gatherers in Britain were black-skinned, and that was true across Western Europe, that they would have been dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers. What does this do to your ideas of what it means to be ethnically British? You know, how do we then understand ideas about the past and what it means? And a lot of nationalist stories about who we are, origin stories about who we are, and really all of this ultimately serves origin stories. This is what it's all about. It's about how do we frame the narrative of who we are, and science always feeds into that and serves those stories. How then do we challenge our origin stories and our narratives, our nationalist narratives, when we know that in the past we didn't look the way we did now? That we are all products of migration. Every single person, everywhere, is a product of migration. And we have always been moving. There's always been this churn. Then how do we make sense of who we are? And I think that, for me, is the most interesting thing, particularly as someone of Indian heritage who was born in this country, grew up here. My son lives here now. My connection to India is not as strong as my parents', but I do have my own relationship with it. Will he have any relationship with it? He will always be brown. So how will he then navigate a world in which he feels completely British, but in Britain he is not always considered British just because of his skin colour? How does he square that? And what about generations going forward after that? We need new ways to think about identity that go beyond biology, because if it's just biology, then it's going to become less and less relevant as we move forward, and the science already has made it less and less relevant.
Thanks. So, I mean, in one sense, what you're saying that it's an impossibility scientifically to understand race through DNA testing, gene testing. But we also know that the idea of the superiority of certain races is almost handed down to us through various disciplines. Can we, as a panel, now think through, I mean, your work on desire, on literature and cinema, art, that some races are superior to others. What Foucault calls a knowledge power complex, that you, so the colonial writing on India gives you a certain power of articulating certain races. Maybe as a panel think through of how else we can look at races and how it has been handled down?
I mean, I think Angela is absolutely right, which is that race is a narrative. It's a story that we are told and that we tell ourselves. I mean, I always like to joke because I spent a lot of time living in the US, and there anyone who's non-white is called a person of color. And I keep saying, but you know, brown or black people really have just one color, whereas white people have white and pink and blue and green and, you know, purple and all that. So it's like you're the people of color. And I like calling myself, saying that. And I used to call myself a person of color because I like being an off-color person. And so these are all really stories we tell ourselves, because being a person of color makes no sense in the way in which it is told.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Angela's already talked about the sort of scientific dispensation that came up with the idea of race, that invented the idea of race not that long ago.
No.
But the problem is, to my mind, is that everyone wants to look to science to prop up the narratives that we already have, on the one hand. And on the other hand, no one really cares about science, because if they did, they would see that the race is an invented phenomenon. So science is in this double bind and is not, to my mind, not doing that much to actually clear the air. And so the storytellers, prime among whom are politicians, are just having carte blanche, as it were, and just sort of doing what they will by categorizing people in particular ways.
One of the phrases which makes my heart sink is when someone says, "Science shows that." Now, science shows lots of things, but the phrase "science shows that" usually means someone who doesn't know what the science is on that subject, but trying to use science as a prop to back up a political or moral argument.
Exactly.
Going back to something that Angela said about British ethnicity, one of the ways we think about ethnicity or Britishness now, or any national identity, is to imagine that Britain now is plural because of mass immigration, whereas in the past it was homogenous. If you go back to the 19th century, that's not how Britain saw themselves. British views, middle-class views of the working class, was as a racially distinct species almost. Certainly as racially distinct. They saw the working class and the rural poor as racially distinct as we now see whites, blacks, Asians, however you want to define that. And we've forgotten that. We've forgotten that because it's changed. It's a historical shift that took place at the beginning of the 20th century, where there was political democracy, and it became much harder with the coming of political democracy to talk about the working class as racially inferior. And secondly, because of the expansion of imperialism, the scramble for Africa and so on, both of which came together to transform the way we talked about race. And so whereas in the 19th century, race was primarily actually about social distinctions and class distinctions, not about skin colour. It became the question of skin colour only primarily in the 20th century. And it's worth remembering, you know, that historical shift that's taken place. But the other thing I think I want to question, I suppose, is this idea about race and superiority. Because, yes, race is often used to make claims of superiority. But one of the interesting things about racial arguments now, and ethnic arguments, is the idea, it's the kind of complex relationship between racial arguments and plural arguments, the idea of pluralism. Because race is often seen as not an expression of inferiority or superiority, even though that may be underneath it, but an expression of difference. And part of the reason that relationship between racial ideas and plural ideas is that in many ways they have the same roots, which is what I call the romantic idea of difference, goes back to the late 18th, early 19th century. A philosopher like Herder, the German philosopher, key to this, for whom different peoples he was a great believer in equality, one of the greatest believers in equality, but he nevertheless saw peoples as divided by their particular modes of living, their language, their histories, their heritages. Each group of people had their own histories and heritages, which were distinct from each other. And the interesting about someone like Herder is that his ideas gave rise to two very distinct modes of thinking. One was it gave rise to racial thinking. It became biologized in the context of race. But it also gave rise to ideas of pluralism. And in that, which became the basis of anti-racism. But today, the two are kind of combined again. And we often think about pluralism and identity and cultural differences in what we call more essential terms, almost in biological or fixed terms. And that's also an issue I think we need to think about.
I'll just ask you another one briefly, if you want to comment on it. That there seems to be, as you were telling me, a kind of return of the right-wing politics, which started in the 18th century, and now interracial politics, and the far right seems to be claiming it. How do you think that cycle has happened from the 18th century?
About notions of white identity and so on. Well, one of the interesting things about identity is that we think about identity as a recent phenomenon, identity politics as a recent phenomenon, and as a politics of the left, of minority and oppressed groups. In fact, it's a phenomenon that arises in the 18th, 19th centuries, at the turn of the 18th, 19th centuries. And it's a product of the reactionary right, not of the left. And it arises out of the challenge to universalist ideas. And its primary expression was that of race. Race, the idea that one's being, one's identity, defined one's place in the world, one's station in the world, one's moral and social rights, one's aspirations, and so on. That was the first politics of identity. And it was only in the post-war world that identity and identity politics became associated with the left for all sorts of complex reasons. We can go into it if you want.
Class and
well, it was largely because even prior to the Second World War, I mean, the challenge to racism, to women's oppression, to homophobia, and so on, is actually a challenge to the politics of identity, the politics of defining people by their identity and defining their rights and needs and duties and obligations and place in the world by their identity. So in that sense, all the great movements, progressive movements in the 19th, 20th centuries against colonialism, against imperialism, against women's oppression, against homophobia and so on, have been movements against the politics of identity. But what also happened was that in the post-war world, many minority groups became disenchanted with the failure of the left in particular to take up their issues, to take up the issues of women's rights, or of gay rights, or of black rights. And so they started organising separately from the broader left, and insisted that to fight for that the only way to bring about black rights or women's rights or gay rights was to organise in their own terms. The early versions of all that, the struggle for women's rights or for black rights or for gay rights and so on were linked to broader struggles for social change. But as those broader struggles for change disappeared, the demand for recognition became an end in itself, and that's what we now call the politics of identity.
Although there is, I mean, you know, even within the movements for these particular rights along whichever group have felt themselves to be oppressed, there were also contradictions within that. So, for example, like you say, in this country, and I have to say the power struggles of different countries run along different lines. So because of the class, and I agree with you, 19th century in Britain, class was the big dynamic. In America, it was different. It was a racial dynamic. In Australia, it was a racial dynamic. And again, it comes down to power. It becomes, we are superior, we are inferior. But then even within that, you get contradictions. For example, during the campaign for women's rights in this country, which was very much, of course, a white feminist movement or a white movement, there was within that an oppression of minorities. There was a racialization of the white feminist movement in itself that then in turn said, you know, that we deserve our rights, but not necessarily women of colour deserving their rights. Black women don't deserve their rights, which is why Sojourner Truth, you know, that wonderful speech that she gave, resulted. Look at the eugenics movement. Eugenics movement in this country, and it took different forms in different places around the world. In this country, it was really class-based, and it was about this group of people, although there were racialized elements to it. Jews were lumped into this in the early 20th century. This is a group of people who are somehow biologically distinct, that they are passing on their fecklessness, feeble-mindedness, their kind of congenital problems to the next generation, and their fertility rates should be curbed for this reasons. But eugenicists included Marie Stopes, you know, leaders, progressive, liberal, the Fabians, you know, many leading progressive figures were eugenicists, and they again racialized this. And again, like you said, sometimes they were talking about the British race and about improving the British race by weeding out the poorer, weaker elements of the British race, and sometimes it was about actual race, as we understand it now. So if you look at, I went to the Science Museum stores to look at Marie Stopes' archive, and on prophylactics, so on these condoms and other birth control devices, is written racial. It's all racialized. It's about improving the quality of the British race.
But the irony, I think, that Kenan was pointing to is that the fixity of bodies, or the fixity of bodily types, or the fixity of genetic codes and genetic inheritances, which was, and to my mind continues to be, an oppressive framework, or a framework by which to further oppression, by telling people you have to stay here or you have to stay there and you cannot move. The irony is that that language and that narrative has now been taken up precisely by those groups and minorities who have been historically oppressed by it. And this to me becomes the big problem. So when, and which is also the problem with, say, rights-based discourses around the world. Because if you follow a rights-based discourse, it's always about rights for me, and people who look like me. And rather than what Kenan was talking about, the much broader social liberation movement and politics that we need to be committed to. And it is that problematic that I see at play, for instance, when people say about homosexuality, well, I'm genetically born that way. And the reason they say that is because they want to speak a language that they think the oppressor will understand. Because of course, you know, with all those homophobic placards in gay pride marches that say, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? The idea that this is God made, this is something natural, this is something biological, this is something that's given to you. Now, if we start speaking that same language and saying, no, 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 we are natural and biological and genetic and we cannot change ourselves, we're actually going hand in glove with our own oppression. And so I think we need to be very, very careful and really keep in mind that irony, that the limitation of the body to an identity politics that is biological in its nature is not a narrative that we want to adopt, because it is not a language of liberation. Everyone thinks identity is liberatory because, oh, now you get to be bisexual, or you get to be transsexual, or you get to be heterosexual, all these multiple I'm always amused by that ever-increasing acronym of LGBTQIA, XYZ, because at one and the same time, it acknowledges that in fact there are multiple things, that you can never be just one thing. But at the same time, it wants to put everything under one umbrella and say, you know, each one of us has our biological specificity. And so, you know, my sort of favorite example is the recent Supreme Court judgment in India that decriminalized homosexuality, which was a wonderful judgment, very, very welcome, and we are so thrilled that it happened.
And proud.
And proud. And you know, many of the lawyers who worked on that case I know well, so I sort of had conversations with them. I think it was an absolute victory, and there's no question about it. But I think actually that it was a legal and narratological defeat. Because the law, as some of you might know, handed down to us by the British from the 19th century, outlaws or bans, what they called in their prudish way, which they couldn't bring themselves to actually say sex, carnal acts against the order of nature, right? That's the phrasing, that's the framing that Macaulay comes up with. And that has been used increasingly to oppress minorities, sexual minorities of all kinds. And the lawyers arguing this case in the Supreme Court, I think, took a leaf out of a lot of arguments that the US, people used in the US Supreme Court to legitimize gay marriage. And they said, well, this is about oppressing homosexuals, oppressing minorities, and we've got to stop it, and that's true. But as I said to them, if carnal acts against the order of nature is defined as anything not conducing to biological reproduction, then every single one of us in this room who is sexually active performs carnal acts against the order of nature.
Yeah.
And so what did we lose by allowing the courts and everybody else to say, this is about the rights of those people over there, those few homosexuals, rather than saying every one of us performs carnal acts against the order of nature. And that's the kind of universalism that I actually find extremely politically important and potent, not saying, I don't need to think about you over there because you over there are biologically different from me, but actually thinking about what this narrative of oppression is that we have all embraced, all of us. The people who oppress us and the people who are oppressed are speaking the same language. And that is extremely worrying. We need to change the language we speak. We need to be much more radical than we are, rather than saying, don't mind us, we'll just sit in a little corner and we'll be exactly like you. We'll talk in your language and the phrases that you want us to use.
Sorry.
Meena, I'll just come to you in one sec.
I didn't open my mouth since I came.
Yeah, that's why.
So I don't want to be shut down for the whole of the time.
No. I was going to give you an entire section. So that's what I was trying to say.
That becomes a reproduction of identity politics. You don't let the only actually oppressed person.
Just coming to turn to you, please.
Okay. So no, I want to take on a lot of things. I was waiting for my turn, and I just want to be heard as well. So one of the things that when you talk about racial distinction, but I think when you come to the particular case of India, you have it codified within, let's say, even the religious structure. So Brahmins, for instance, would just out of the accident of birth be seen as superior. And people who are, let's say, the Shudra caste or oppressed caste would be seen as inferior and therefore relegated to menial jobs. So the kind of class divisions that we talk about, the working class versus, the ruling class, this is actually codified within caste itself. So some people do the intellectual labors and therefore are high on the spectrum, whereas those who have been seen as inferior are asked to do menial jobs, which are seen as, which is kind of class divisions that Marx himself speaks about when it comes to who does the working class jobs. And Ambedkar actually beautifully speaks about how class is not a division of labor as much as it's a division of laborers, and how this system is kept intact through, I think, endogamy and marrying within specific caste groups. So I think that's important. Also, what Kenan was pointing out about the rise of identity politics. Again, right now, even the left, it's in this context seen as something the left has given birth to or kind of espoused. But you also have a context where the left is increasingly shy of identity politics, kind of like, oh, you're making concessions to identity politics. So if you're a woman within the left and you want to bring up women's issues, you're seen as, oh, you're making concessions to identity politics. So if you're talking about, Dalit politics, you're seen as, oh, you're talking about identity. And often the issue of identity politics is used to shut down voices
who may be making very legitimate demands.
This is one thing which I wanted to ask you, Meena, was that often I'm asked by folks here or wherever I travel for conferences that caste seems to be a particular problem in India or in certain parts of South Asia. Should we look at caste as a particular problem there, or can we, when we try and analyze the power politics behind caste, look at it as intersectionalities, as we have been talking about? Can we, theorize, or you don't like academic language, I know, you've told me. How does one try and analyze caste beyond the locals of India?
I think that to reduce caste to simply caste is also like a kind of limitation of what it is, because even on national politics, people don't address it or speak about it so much today, because BJP's politics is one language, one nation, one religion. But some of it actually in the early 1920s was about the Aryan versus Dravidian myth, which people were fighting. And Madhavi made this point about speaking their language, but sometimes even the most radical people are forced to speak the language of the oppressors. So a lot of Periyar's work is trying to say how we are Dravidians, we are proud to be Dravidians, why we worship Ravan, and going back to Ramayana or this epic, where the people of the South are shown as monkeys. In a sense, the reduction to a non-human as a racial prototype is always to show people as apes, monkeys, whatever comes on the spectrum of animals. So, whereas the Aryans were seen as fair-skinned, northern, tall, whereas the people of the South were seen as dark-skinned, shorter, all of this. So in the 1920s, a lot of politics was Aryan versus Dravidian, demands for a separate Dravidian country, and trying to, at the same time, use who are the original people myth, so saying that, oh, you Aryans are invaders, theories that have since been debunked, but still trying to portray as a counter response, oh, you are invaders, oppressors, and therefore out with all of you, and with your politics of caste, your politics of language imposition, and all of that. And I think that's where it's actually, in a sense, caste which is at play there as well, because when did caste come into society? One of the mistakes we make is we think caste has been forever, but when is the first instance of caste in, let's say, recorded literature? Did it come with, let's say, in Tamil literature, was there just a differentiation of work, or was it much more older? So I think these are important questions to ask when we study caste.
Yeah, and I think it's always tied to questions of dirt. And pollution, and this, I'm reminded of, and I actually talk about this in my book, in Kerala, there is this entire thing of when Brahmin women walk to the temple, if any lower caste person happens to cross their way, the helper of the Brahmin woman will draw a line, measure the distance physically between the Brahmin woman and the lower caste person to see if in fact pollution has occurred. And if the lower caste person is a carpenter and is carrying his measuring rod, then the idea is that there's no pollution. There is no logic to this. But it is all about the language of dirt and purity. It's all about the language of pollution and cleanliness, which is why I'm very wary of current projects in India like the much touted Swachh Bharat, which is ostensibly about providing more toilets or cleaning the streets of India. Terrific, wonderful, I'm all for that. But what we see it's really about is about cleansing the narrative that we're telling about India. And so the narrative that we're telling about India is increasingly become singular, single, pure, and unpolluted, right? It's about the sort of upper caste Brahmin heterosexual narrative. And that's what Swachh Bharat is about. So every time we subscribe to ideas of cleanliness, we have to realize that in political terms, cleanliness and purity are very, very dangerous terms.
Just a second. When Modi got elected to power, previously, I think the BJP manifesto promised that manual scavenging would be stopped. That has been like 5 years in power, another 5 years. Yesterday, 7 people died cleaning, sewage in Gujarat, actually, which is Modi's model of development for the rest of the country. And then this is a question that we have to ask. Like, it's obviously a job that's given to a particular subcaste of Dalits, depending on the geography. So it's obviously a Dalit question. It's a question of caste. And how do we articulate it? How does the left take up this kind of issue? Because when you go back to the first trade union strike in Chennai in 1921, a caste Hindu laborer was asked to clean up after himself because he was not given a toilet break. So basically the Buckingham and Carnatic mills, all of the mills went on strike. But the heart of it was, I am not going to do the job of an untouchable. Yeah. And so trade unions rallied around this question. So how far have we come in terms of, as far as, the left can claim progressiveness? And I'm sure there's very good intention there. But are we stepping out of the boundaries of caste to address it?
Look, I'm also having to keep an eye on the watch. Sorry. So I'm going to take another trip. Desire. Desire is all about purity, keeping within bounds. Not desire, like how we try and constrain desire. And your recent work has focused a lot on various art forms in India, which, and even regular our history, our everyday life, which disrupts this narrative of purity, which we try and impose. Do you want to talk a bit about desire and how desire and studying desire can actually disrupt a lot of these myths which we build up?
Absolutely. I think one of the most fascinating things that I found while I was working on this book, which is called A History of Desire in India, is that the oldest traditions of desire that we can draw across, certainly the region's two most important religious traditions of what is now called Hinduism and Islam, desire is that thing which does not have a body, which is in complete opposition to Western notions of how we think about desire. Because in the West, when we think about desire, we always need to locate it to a body, right? So such and such has heterosexual desire, or such and such has bisexual desire, and it's always a body that embodies it. But what's fascinating about Indian traditions, and I think this is such a refreshing counterblast in the face of this kind of growing schismatic politics that we're seeing everywhere in the world, is the sense of, for instance, Kama, which is the Hindu god of desire. The story goes that he's shooting a bow, very much like his Greek and Roman counterpart, shooting a bow at Shiva to awaken him from his meditation so Shiva can have sex, which was the other thing he did in addition to meditate, right? He either meditated or he had sex. So awaken Shiva from his meditation, and Shiva wakes up and is so furious at being awakened, opens his third eye and burns Kama to cinders. And then Parvati comes and says, wait a minute, you can't just kill the god of love and desire. And Shiva says, okay, he can come back to life, but he's not going to have a body. Now this idea, which the Sufis, for instance, take up in India from the 12th, 13th centuries onwards, is always about desire being both about the body in front of you and much beyond the body that's in front of you. And this is very much also then, if you sort of do a historical sweep, because I'm aware that we're running short of time, if you come all the way to the 20th century and start thinking about psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud, the entire point of psychoanalysis is that desire cannot be exhausted by or contained by a body. If it were, then we would only sort of want to have sex with or desire one body for the rest of our lives, which again, I don't presume to speak for any of you in particular, I think is true for all of us, right? That we don't. Where would sort of the film industry be if we didn't desire? Where would the glamour industry be if we did not desire things that cannot be contained within one body?
In your book, you mentioned a few Bollywood instances of desire. Nasreen is here. So a couple of instances for the audience that how it breaks the stereotypical, this conversation that we have.
Well, I mean, one of my favorite ones, and very, very quickly, and is a movie called Ded Ishqiya. Has anyone seen it here, other than Munni, of course, who's seen every film? If you haven't seen it, you should leave this tent right now and go and watch that film, because it's worth much more than anything I can tell you here. It's a film called Ded Ishqiya, which translates in English as 1.5 desire, or 1.5 love. And it's a spoiler alert, I'm giving away the story. It's about a romantic love, sexual relationship between two women. But we don't find out about that. We don't find out about that till the very end. But the joke is on us, because actually it's been evident throughout the film that these two women are in love with one another and are sleeping with each other and have a romantic relationship with one another. But we are so used to seeing only heterosexuality on film that we don't know how to look And what's fascinating to me about this film is that it's based on a short story written by Ismat Chughtai. Again, I have this wonderful poster where Ismat Chughtai is writing in the 1930s and 40s. Sexual revolution, right? You know, we had it centuries ago in the Indian subcontinent. Ismat Chughtai writes a short story called Lihaf, which means the quilt, which is all about two women sexually involved with one another as being spied upon by a little girl who can't tell what's going on underneath the quilt. And she keeps saying, this quilt keeps rising and falling and I have no idea what's going on. And the movie takes that idea of both knowing and not knowing. That we know our desires are multiple, but at the same time we don't want to know it because it's a scary thought. And I don't want to underestimate that it is scary, but that it is much truer to the way in which we actually live to acknowledge the fact that desires are multiple. That they cannot, in fact, be contained by bodies. And so, but if we don't recognize that, we don't actually see the two lesbians.
But the state does try and intervene, doesn't it? And they brand it obscene.
Well, what was fascinating about Ismat Chughtai, she's brought to trial in the Lahore High Court under the British, of course, for obscenity, right? It's an obscenity charge against this short story because someone's complained that, quite rightly to my mind, it's a wonderfully obscene story. Her lawyer gets her off by asking one simple question to all the people who are witnesses against her. He says, can you point to one single word in the story that's obscene? And no one can, because there isn't. There is not one word in this extremely pornographic, sexually rich story that is obscene. And so the judge has to let her off. And so that's what I'm saying, the emphasis we put on being out there by using certain recognizable codes actually ignores the vast ocean of language and ideas and tropes and desires that go unrecognized by us because we don't know how to look.
Thank you. We have almost kind of run out of time, and before I open the floor, a poem from you.
Sorry.
After you add something to
Sorry. The thing is about the language that Madhavi mentioned, and I want to go back to the Tolkappiyam, which is like the world's oldest extant grammar. And of the Tamil language, and this basically discusses Tamil poetics and how do you look at poetics, and it divides love of various types, and it says there is a love that you can call May December of very old and very young people, or the love of a disabled person, or the love between the very rich and the very poor, and it says these are all just like one-sided love. This is not, you know, like the normal trope of love. And so when you have Sangam poetry, let's say 2,000 poems or 4,000 poems survive, hardly 8 or 9 poems of these margins survive because poets were told within their grammars that this is not the normal love. So love that is disparate is already excluded within the grammar of a language, and therefore when you creatively exercise poetry, you try to put it within the mainstream or, you know, and not at the borders.
What's fascinating
so I think that some of these inequalities constructed as a culture, even within our thought or at the level of grammar, at the level of language.
Yeah.
I just finished.
No, absolutely, except a lot of the same-sex poetry written in India, all written in Persian, which is a gender-free language. So in fact, you cannot be told whether your beloved is male or female, and the poets all play with that idea radically and beautifully. And scholars are sort of united in saying that much more Persian poetry was written in India than in Persia itself. So we have this rich, rich, rich history of Persian poetry in India that is incredibly out there, as the young ones say today.
Thank you.
Poem from you.
No.
Sure?
No, fine.
Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor now. What do we have? We have race, scientific basis for race, desire, caste, and class. Feel free. There.
In the context of the fact
Are you asking anyone in particular? Or the
I'm
panel?
asking the whole panel. It's all been very insightful in terms of what everybody has contributed and the discussion in line with what's taking place in Hong Kong against one of the most powerful countries in the world. I wondered what, in terms of caste, class, race, you all think are going to be the ways forward to address these issues and seriously challenge these issues.
Who wants to go?
Meena?
And by these issues, you mean?
Race, class.
Oh, I see. How to move forward on race and
caste.
class and caste.
perhaps I can pick up on this question of desire, because it kind of feeds into this, and the policing of desire, because the policing of desire is only part of a much broader set of rules and regulations, social rules about policing, where we set up certain spheres as sacred or beyond, or which you cannot enter, and certain spheres that are allowable to you. And that can happen at the level of sexuality. Yeah. But it can also happen at the level of religion. So blasphemy is precisely that same kind of policing in a different context. And it can also happen in a secular basis, which is not just the policing of desire, but the policing of offence. Yeah. So offence becomes something that you cannot do, and it becomes a means of defining what is and is not acceptable. Yeah. So I think we should see all these things as part of the process of policing human beings. Yeah. So that, and the ultimate aim of all that, as is actually ideas of race and so on, is to limit challenge to authority. In other words, by insisting that only certain things are allowable, certain acts, certain people, certain ways of talking, certain things that can be said.
But we internalize it also.
We also, Kenan, I mean, I agree with you, but also by allowing categories. So it's not just the policing, it's by saying you can be whoever you are, whatever that means, as long as you're legible to the state in a particular category or the other. That becomes the problem. Because then what do you do? And this is why my interest in desire. What do you do with things that do not fit into categories? And so we think we sort of are liberated by saying, oh, we are X or Y. But actually the very fact that we are being asked whether we're X or Y is itself already an act of oppression. So I mean, I actually find your question wonderful and an impossible one to answer. Precisely because we're working within those constraints, and we've got to have some way of thinking otherwise. Yeah.
There was a reference to, and you did talk a little bit about politicians. Yeah. And here we are. We had the latest Trump versus Sadiq exchange this morning. But my question is really about, yes, we're seeing politicians, and in India, but also elsewhere, use identity in a very divisive way. Yeah. And intersectionality is part of that. But I just wanted to ask the other side to that, I think, and maybe I would ask you to explore a bit, and that is the extraordinary bringing together of people. You couldn't be in London and avoid what happened a few weeks ago with the Extinction Rebellion. And there are other examples, the anti-corruption movement in India. So my question is, to what extent do these broader issues play a role, or can play a role, or can play more of a role in bringing together a more considered and thoughtful approach to intersectionality?
I mean, sorry, you were addressing that to me? Yeah. Okay. I love what you said, because that's the optimist's view of the world, right? Optimistically, and I'm with you completely, we need to build solidarities across what are now boundaries. There is no way ahead, no way forward without forging ties that cut across categories into which we have been put, or categories that we have been placed in. Unfortunately, I don't actually think that's what's happening. I think we are getting more and more ghettoized. I think we're getting more and more siloed. I think we're getting more and more, for lack of a better verb, social media-tized. Which is to say, we are getting into a world in which everything is either like or not like. And it's not about larger coalitions. It's not about larger thinking. And I think all these political movements, whether it's Modi or Trump or Brexit, are all a product of me first. And the idea of solidarity politics that you're talking about, which is so appealing, is all about the we, the us. And I was just sort of working on this, and the idea of communication, the etymology of communication, the word comes from speaking with others. But communication now has become all about social media, which is all about like or not like. It's not about communicating at all. So until we learn to speak again with one another, until we learn to speak new languages, I don't see that optimistic view of the world in which I would love to live.
Anyone else wants to comment on this?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, this speaks again to what Meena was saying earlier, which is You're right that it's the speaking that's part of the problem, but I think it's also listening. We just, for the first time perhaps in history, the media is not controlled by just a few conglomerates, and we all have a voice. We're not doing enough listening to each other, and we each have to be able to understand that there are people who have lived through experiences which we will not understand, and we have to take time to understand them, to hear them, to have empathy with them, whoever they are and wherever they sit on the political spectrum. I mean, one thing, the experience of writing both Inferior and Superior meant interviewing people with abhorrent views, people who deny my equal humanity as a woman and as a brown person. But listening to them, I started to understand that they weren't born with these ideas. They got them from somewhere. There is something in their history, in their lives, that led them to this political place, whatever that is. In the case of men's rights activists, very often it's that they were spurned by a woman when they were a teenager. Something as simple as that, or their mum wasn't nice to them when they were growing up. We need to be able to listen to each other. And I think, this week, partly because of a lot of racist trolling that I've been having since Superior came out, I left social media, and for the first time I'm just listening. I'm not thinking about how can I put my voice out there now and say something and react to something. It's not important. The most important thing is listening.
The second one, please.
The question is for Meena.
No.
So, whatever we're talking about caste here, but how do we take it to an average middle class casteist? Because how do you bring change in them? How do you take this conversation to the average middle class person who is a born casteist, right? So.
The question is anybody a born racist? Is anybody a born casteist? They have got these ideas from somewhere. So I think that we have to start. As an individual who wants to fight, I make a huge appeal all the time to women, and a lot of even Dalit or anti-caste people are asking me like, oh, you're pandering to women, to Savarna women, but I'd say that I don't think that you have to break up women to it. I think we have a real a kind of class appeal towards women, because women are, irrespective where they are on the spectrum, controlled hugely. I'm sure they have privileges arising out of caste, but they are controlled hugely. And I think in terms of demographics, and if you want to defeat a system, you still have to think in terms of a very unequal system, a system that has to be defeated. If 50% of women rebel against caste, if 50% of women refuse to adhere to caste, and caste can only produce itself out of reproduction, and if women stop laboring into caste, then there is a certain way you can have a break with the system, not necessarily in terms of a radical social economic overhaul, but in terms of just politicizing them, asking them to challenge it. So I think one of the things would be to appeal to make it a feminist issue, which I think for me is very personal, but also at the same time try to build broader alliances just outside of caste frameworks. For instance, like the new education policy of Modi, for instance, it leaves out a lot of people who belong to the oppressed caste. So how do we fight that? So, and I also think we have to go back to the working class. I know it's very simple and rudimentary to say that, but I think that what is happening to bodies under capitalism is a big question for all of us to unpack.
Two more, one here and then Salil after that.
Hi. I wanted to know your opinion about meritocracy, which is a huge thing in like tech and like academia right now. If you're like talented enough, you will like get off the rung. And but talking about this particular thing of caste and race and all of it, you can sort of see that like meritocracy is not as black and white as you would like it to be. So I just wanted your opinion about that.
Please. Anyone of you?
Well, because I do a lot of tech talks, and I work a lot with Silicon Valley firms, and one thing that always amazes me, there are a lot of, we often imagine that the sexists and the racists are the uneducated people, but there are a lot of racists and sexists inside the tech world, of course, in Silicon Valley, as there are in academia, as there are in politics, who very firmly believe that the world is the way it is, the inequality we see is natural. It's just how things have shaken out. Men are overrepresented, certain races and certain castes are overrepresented because they're just better at doing this thing. And it shocks me sometimes how prevalent that view is, including in India. So I have a chapter on caste because I look at this quite, even within geneticists, among Indian geneticists, there is this belief that caste makes some people better at certain things. That the caste division of labour reflects a natural ability that people have to do certain jobs. And as we've seen, there's a wonderful study done in the US where they looked at, there are reservations for scheduled castes in certain government jobs. And they looked at the performance of how people do as a result of these reservations. And there's this common assumption that people of a lower caste will not do better in these jobs. In fact, they do either the same or better, which is exactly what we should expect. There is the same diversity of capability within groups as you would expect in the population at large. And I just find it so frustrating that again and again, when we're fighting, so I do a lot of STEM outreach work when it comes to gender. And again, I keep hitting this barrier of people saying, well, women just aren't as good at maths, or women just aren't as good at physics, they don't have the brain for this kind of thing. That has never historically been true. The first computer programmers were women. They were all women. It was a woman's job once upon a time. When it became lucrative and commoditized, then men took over. And this is how power works. It makes you believe that inequality is natural. Yeah. This is what it has always done. This is kind of the root of it all. These ideas of superiority and inferiority are all about making us believe, the people in power making us believe that this inequality is natural rather than engineered by them.
Kenan, you want to and then Salil, please, the last question, Kenan, please.
Well, we shouldn't forget that meritocracy as a word was introduced as a form of satire. When Young wrote about it, it was a satirical view of a meritocratic world. And that meritocracy is used to obscure the fact that we don't live in a meritocratic world, that we live in a world full of divisions, class, race, sexual divisions, which act as an obstacle to any kind of meritocracy, any kind of mobility. Can I just pick up on the previous question?
We have got 2 minutes left.
Okay, yeah. Because I think one of the big shifts that's taken place is in how we think about solidarity. Yeah. That solidarity, you can think about solidarity in two terms, in terms of the politics of solidarity or the politics of identity. And the first is that we come together in terms of the values that we have or the kind of society that we want to create. Politics of identity says we come together because of who we are. Yeah. And the idea of the kind of society we want to create has shifted from what kind of values or institutions do we want to what kind of people do we want to live in that. And the meaning of who we are has shifted from what kind of society do I want to create, that defines who I am, to what's my history and heritage or ethnicity. Yeah. And I think
my DNA.
And who I should affiliate with, who I should show solidarity with, has shifted quite dramatically in the past 30, 40 years. And I think that's a major problem in the way we think about who we are and who we associate with.
Yeah. But the challenge here is that when we fight our battles for equality, we have to fight them, as you said, on the basis of the identities that we've been given by our oppressors. So we can't relinquish that completely, because if women were to fight for women's rights but then lose any notion of what being
But we want men to fight for women's rights too. We don't want men to say this has nothing to do with
but we're fighting for women. What I'm saying is women. We've created this category woman.
But men need to fight for women's rights too.
Yes, of course. What I'm saying is the category itself, the women's rights category. Yeah. The reason that came about is because we were oppressed as this group. We are not homogeneous within that group. There is so much difference biologically in what it means to be male or female. In fact, the two categories don't encompass everything that we are. Yeah. But we have to fight as women because that's the nature that it takes. So we can't relinquish the categories on the one hand. On the other hand, we do want to live in a world in which we have transcended these biological categories.
No, except as I just said, if we don't relinquish these categories, and I agree with you, but the flip side of that is that the men will say, oh, this has nothing to do with us. Because they too are not relinquishing their category. And I think that is the danger that we need to be aware of and actually be very careful about.
Anyone else?
I think there's I would just say, I think there's a distinction between saying we fight for women's rights or gay rights or black rights, i.e. the right of women and of gays and of blacks to be treated the same as everybody else, and saying that our values come from our identities. I think that they're two different things we're talking about, and we should separate those two things.
On this question of, you know, men fighting for women or caste Hindus fighting, I think they have, unless they're actually encountering it through, you know, a partner or a sister or a mother or a neighbor or something, a lot of people are not, let's say, social justice oriented in the same way. Like there has to be some, you know, like a personal wake-up call for those in privilege to extend their voices, which is why I think it becomes more urgent for women to fight for women's rights, for oppressed people to fight for oppressed people's rights, for black people.
But I don't want to get the oppressors off the hook. I don't want to let them off the hook and say, you just sit in your little bubble and we'll do the fighting.
That's true, but they don't always understand.
I'm afraid we have run out of time. Yes, it's 12:15. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, all four of you.
Thank you.